At least some in our party seem to be willing to settle for the status quo. As I said, that would be the biggest mistake, because our party, I think, has maybe the historic duty to finalize the project of democratization, which is not there yet. Turkey has made important steps forward. It's not there yet, and I really hope that if we have this seminar in 5 years, that we don't have to come to the conclusion that 2012, that was more or less it, and after that our party is still in power, but no reform. That would be my biggest worry. Thank you very much.
Turkish politics and Turkish society. And I've also been trying to connect this story to the larger story of Islam and modernity, Islam and democracy, and Islam and even liberal democracy. Because I think there are democracies and liberal democracies. And if a democracy is not liberal at the same time, it can be also not a very rewarding political system. It can be an illiberal democracy. Anyway, just a different, like a theoretical discussion about the nature of our political systems. But let me tell you something tonight. In the West, there are narratives about Turkey. And today I want to particularly challenge one of the narratives that is made somewhat famous in the West by some actually Dutch politicians or thinkers, like Geert Wilders, if I spell his name right, or the former Dutch, now American, if I'm not wrong, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, maybe she's still Dutch, I don't know her personality, like citizenship. Some public personalities like these. I mean, I respect their point of view, I disagree with them, but they basically said democracy is bad for Muslim communities because democracy brings wrong people to power. Democracy brings more Islamic-minded people to power in places like Turkey, in places like Egypt, in Tunisia, and so forth. So actually, we should have not democracy; we should have authoritarian secular regimes. So these people were actually very critical of the fall of Mubarak in Egypt. They are very critical of developments in Tunisia, the Arab Spring, and also what I call the Turkish Spring, which is a very, very long story, which began, to my point of view, in 1950, but it's still going on. But I disagree with that narrative, and let me tell you why I disagree with that. First of all, we should understand that, I'm in favor of a secular state, and I think a secular state is a very good idea, because it's a neutrality towards different religions. If a secular state, as Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan said in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt a few months ago, is basically a state which is at equal distance to Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, Buddhists, New Ageists, whatever you call it. I think it's good for all of them, if that's a kind of a neutral state. But we should also understand that being secular by itself is not enough. While North Korea is a secular state, in the sense of being not defined by religion. Well, Stalin's Russia was a secular state. Mao's China was a secular state. So I think a secular state is a good idea, but what is most important to me is the question of whether this secularism serves democracy, whether this secularism serves liberalism, whether this secularism serves individual rights and freedoms. Because these are for me, the highest values of any political system. So in order to say, so I think the people who say Turkey has been secular from 1923 and this is perfect and wonderful are missing, I think, a critical point. Yes, Turkey used to be secular and we should remain as a secular state, and very few people discuss that in Turkey actually. The people, like the so-called Islamists in Turkey, actually have criticized not secularism but the excessive secularism of our state tradition. But Turkey, this secular state, this secular Turkey, was also the Turkey who argued that Kurds are actually mountain Turks who had to be re-Turkified. I think it was a bad idea, And before this secular, so-called modern enlightened Turkey, Kurds used to be Kurds as, for centuries under the Ottoman Empire. Nobody thought that they should be converted into something else in the pre-modern so-called Ottoman Empire. Or, again, one of the... So people who criticize Turkey's absolutely wrong policies and very even condemnable policies against the Kurdish minority should understand that maybe this problem comes from the very state that they have been venerating from a different point of view. Or another thing, like for example, Turkey, one of the, of course, very important bones of contention about Turkey is the fate of the Ottoman Armenians. And the ethnic cleansing of Ottoman Armenians in 1915 is a tragic, tragic episode of Turkish history. And I think we Turks need to understand that better. We Turks need to be more empathetic. We Turks need to share the pain of the Armenians about that. But let's also remember that before 1915, Armenians had been living side by side Turks for centuries in this pre-modern, non-secular, so-called darkness, religious age under the Ottoman Empire. I mean, Armenians were there for ages under the Ottomans. Their institutions were, accepted and given guarantee. They had become equal citizens in the 19th century and so on and so forth. So I'm just emphasizing these 2 points because I think this idea that Turkey being a secular state in 1923 solved all the problems in Turkey is a wrong idea. Turkey is still not a perfect democracy, and we still have a lot of problems, and we can discuss about them in the Q&A session. But it is much, much, much more nuanced and complicated than the people who think, oh, the Turkey, by being a secular state in 19... And then came the Turkish Republic in 1923 to save us from this darkness and bring us to the age of enlightenment and modernity and so on. Well, not really. When you look at the Ottoman Empire, first of all, you see that it was a pluralist empire from the beginning. So Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, Jews existed in the Ottoman Empire as, not as equal citizens until the Tanzimat, I'll come to that, but as free and secure people. But in the Ottoman Empire, Muslims were higher than the Christians. It was a hierarchical structure, as it was in most of the modern states in the world. But in the 19th century, by the period that we call Tanzimat, reorganization, the Ottomans started to accept European legal and political ideas. And the first of them was equal citizenship. And that's why the Ottoman Empire in this Tanzimat period, which began in 1849, accepted, first of all, that the Sultan's power should be limited. Everybody should go to court before any execution. And most importantly, Jews and Christians should be equal citizens as Muslims. That apostasy should not be punished, which is a big controversy still going on in the Muslim world, in some parts of the Muslim world. That's why in the late Ottoman Empire you had Christian missionaries opening schools. French schools in Istanbul, Saint Benoit, Saint Joseph, all those were opened under the Ottoman Empire. The Halki Seminary of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Turkey, which is still closed today, it was closed by generals in Turkey after a coup in 1971, was opened under the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. And most importantly, the Ottoman Empire accepted a parliamentary system in 1876. The Ottoman Empire accepted a constitution, declared a constitution in 1876, which declared all citizens are equal. The Ottoman Parliament had 1/3 of its members as non-Muslims. Sultan Abdülhamid unfortunately stopped that democratic process for a while, but it was reinstituted in 1909 with the period we call the Second Constitutional Period. And again, when you look at from 1909 to the end of the Ottoman Empire, you have a multi-party system functioning in the Ottoman Empire. In this multi-party system, you have liberals, Akbar Party, you have the party of İttihat ve Terakki, Progress and the Union, and you have their opponents, and you have the socialists, and you have the more conservatives, and so on. So there was an experience of democracy in the late Ottoman Empire. This is important. This is important for a few reasons. First of all, to show that democracy is not ruthless in Turkey. And secondly, it's also important to note that the Ottoman Empire, although it secularized its system to some extent, was a state that justified itself through Islam. It was an Islamic state. It was run by the king. But it was accepting this democratic transformation, which is, I think, very important today because some Islamic-minded people in the 20th century, 21st now, I'm a little old compared to most of you, they think that Islam and democracy are incompatible. Well, I think they're wrong, and one example to prove that they're wrong is to look at the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the people who think that Islam and democracy are incompatible are not just radical Islamists, but also radical secularists. And again, some may be critics of Islam, again, Mr. Akyol Joost and others in the West. And I think both of these views on the nature of Islam and democracy are wrong. Anyway, so we should see this, first of all, the Ottoman roots of Turkish democracy. What happened after the Ottoman Empire? Well, it fell, like most multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires, like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire or the Russian Empire in World War I. And Turkey became a republic. And in Turkey, we think that by becoming a republic, we solved our problems. Well, I mean, I think most important question in a political system is not whether it's a republic or a monarchy. The question is whether it's democratic or not, or whether it's liberal or not. I mean, if I'm not wrong, you have a queen in Holland, right? I mean, Holland is not a republic, but it is a very democratic and liberal country as far as I can see it. So the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the republic is not a big, I think, transformation. And I mean, it's not a wrong one, but it's not necessarily a blessing. What was a problem, though, in the Republican era was that the Turkish Republic, which was created actually by a democratic parliament in 1923, quickly turned into a one-party system, a single-party system. From 1925 to 1950, the Kemalist People's Republican Party founded by Atatürk and his followers, it closed down all opposition parties and established a single-party system. Now, all single-party systems and all authoritarian regimes argue that they're doing something which is good for society. And sometimes they do. For example, the single party in Turkey advanced women's rights. I think that was a thing to welcome and bless and protect. But they also make some wrong decisions. And since there's no opposition to criticize them, they keep on doing those wrong things. For example, the Turkification of Turkey's Kurds, which is a very wrong decision, which we're trying to recover from right now, was a policy initiated by this Kemalist regime of between 1925 to 1950. It was Atatürk's famous slogan, "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene." How happy is the one who says I'm a Turk? Now that's the founding motto of Turkey. And it's a funny thing, like I saw this slogan some 10 years ago when I first went to Diyarbakır. In the middle of Diyarbakır there was this like a military garrison. And on one of the walls of the garrison, it writes, "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene," which means how happy is the one who says I'm a Turk. And then to protect this wall from people, there's like a 10-meter barbed wire in front of the wall because people throw like stones to the wall. Apparently, people in the city are not that happy to call themselves a Turk. I mean, it took 8 or 9 decades to understand that this was a wrong policy. But when we started to challenge that, some people started to say, "Oh, Turkey's going back to darkness, the Ottoman ages, and so on." I said, "Well, we are not going back to darkness, but actually, yeah, the Ottoman idea was not too bad when compared to this assimilationist point of view." So I think we should see all these nuances. But one thing that I think has made Turkish democracy more promising, or maybe more successful than the now newly emerging democracies in the Arab world, is that we were lucky for one thing. Arab countries too, after their independence, fell into the hands of these single-party regimes or dictators. In Syria, the Ba'ath regime, which is still killing people, as you see. I hope it will fall soon, but we'll come to that. In Iraq, it was the Ba'ath tyranny of, again, this time Saddam Hussein. In Egypt, it was Nasser and Sadat and Mubarak, one man and one party. In Libya, it was Gaddafi. Again, not even a party, just one man and nothing else at this time. And then in Tunisia, it was this regime of Ben Ali and his, before Ben Ali, it was Habib Bourguiba, yeah, certainly. Now, here's one thing, let me tell you. Some of these regimes were praised in the West. Why? Because they're secular. But again, being secular doesn't guarantee that you are democratic or you are liberal. And actually some of these regimes, secular regimes, did things which actually created new problems in the Middle East. Like what? Well, because they are dictatorships. They oppressed opposition. And the opposition included Islamic groups.